would still be the same, so you'd end up having to get more people, pay them, and you have less money, and then you still end up with the same problem that we have.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see how it goes. Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't mind it. I mean, honestly, more than 40 hours a week now, isn't enough. We're dropping miles. I usually take those as well. I'll go back working 27 hours a week.
Now, are you part-time?
Well, part-time, full-time.
Okay, I was about to say, I thought you made that transition.
Yeah. I'm technically an employee, part-time hours, full-time hours.
That's true.
So, yeah.
But at the end of all this, be like, man, it's great to be full-time.
Yeah.
So when we cut back hours, I'm still full-time, right?
Yeah, really.
Benefits and everything?
It all depends on a lot of stuff with, they're starting to build another center in Kodak. So, maybe there may be a good thing for me to go drop in some of the best sports. We'll see.
I feel like after Jacob started trying driving, it was just too much time on the road.
Yeah.
Drove him crazy.
Y'all been staying busy for a while?
Staying busy, avoiding everything.
Yes. Yes. I understand that for sure.
Are you dizzy too?
Okay, I gotta start this.
Hi. Hi. Good morning. Okay, glad to see everybody this morning. We're going to have some people rolling in late, some people not here today. Some are in Arkansas, some are elsewhere. But nonetheless, good to see y'all this morning. So, what's going on in life? Any prayer requests? Any updates on people?
Randy Maddox got rushed to Holston Valley, had a minor heart attack, and it looked like the major one was going to follow it. So he's over there now.
This all happened last night?
The day before.
Oh my.
Yeah.
We wave at them, but we never actually met some of them. Yeah.
So there's a cluster of Maddoxes right there.
They have a compound.
Oh my. Okay, so keep Randy in your prayers. Anybody else?
Holly's surgery's on the 22nd.
Okay.
And from what the doctor told her, I don't know. It just doesn't look good as far as what her diagnosis might be. I'm keeping hopeful.
So we're going down there. She gets out of the hospital on the 24th. We're driving down the day before and staying for 4 or 5 days to be with her. So we won't be here over Christmas.
Okay. I was about to say, are you all going down there for that?
Okay. Mary's going to be here because she has to stay and take care of the cats and the dogs.
Does she?
Yeah.
I'm not saying that, and man, why? Don't take that the wrong way. Okay. Oh my. Okay. Okay. Oh my.
And he knows by what I'm putting on if I'm staying home or if I'm going somewhere.
Oh my goodness.
Very smart.
We also need to keep Jean White in our prayers. Napier, maybe. I don't know. No, Jean White's not feeling too good today. So if we can keep her in her prayers, she's having some chest pains. She might be here, maybe, but keep her in mind. Anybody else? It's a prayer. Oh, that's not good. He's going to be sitting over here. Oh, how nice. How nice. Well, if I have enough faith, I won't get sick. It's a joke. Oh my. Okay. Anybody else we need to be praying for?
Are the Hickses sick or are they still?
No, Sandra is still on cruise mode and David's still hunting, I think. I may give him a holler. He may not have heard his alarm either. Which, if he wasn't hunting, then he might be down in Georgia, one of the two. So I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, she should be back this week. She'll be back on the 13th. Okay, well, Jacob, we'll ask you, if you will, say a prayer for these that we mentioned, for Randy, Holly, Jean White, Miles, and also prepare our minds for a Bible study. Thank you. Okay, this morning we're continuing through lesson 2 through the book of Obadiah. If you'd like to turn to chapter 2, it's on page 11. Obadiah is only one chapter, so we're just focusing on verses 10 through 14 this morning. Now, the book of Obadiah, if you recall from last week, we were talking about how the commentator focuses this entire one chapter series on conflicts, and there's different types of conflicts. Conflicts within the church, conflicts within the world and culture, conflicts within the workplace, and what Obadiah focuses on are conflicts within families. In fact, as we talked about Romans 12:18, as much as depends on you and I, let us live peaceably with all men. That's hard sometimes because there's some people we get along with just fine, and there's some people we don't just fine. And that can be a problem, especially within the church. And really, when you think about it, is there a personality type that God cannot use for His glory? God can use everybody for His glory in some way. Now, whether or not they respond, that's a different aspect. But in view of personality, everybody's made in such a different way that it's needful for the kingdom to be edified and for it to grow in the right way. And as we talked about in view of God wanting resolution through these conflicts, we started looking at the 3 lessons that aren't necessarily on the forefront in the book, but they're emphasized in the background of the lessons. And we looked at a little bit at Jacob and Esau, which is what Obadiah really focuses on for the background setting. In view of relationships, we talked about how reckless problems, if we don't handle our problems correctly and we just kind of toss them to the side, they have long-lasting effects. Well, today we want to look at how some people tend to reflect on problems, and that's all they leave the family atmosphere with. You did this in the past, we never made amends for it, and now we've been separated for all this time. Well, that's not uncommon to a lot of families. In fact, you'll find commonly today, people don't want to get together. They'd rather do their own thing and stay apart. Well, can we do that if we're really children of God? We claim we love each other. Can we say it's better if we just don't meet up? Well, that's kind of what we're going to look at this morning. So when we're looking deeper into what we talked about last week, the conflict that Edom had, they had a pride problem, they had a trust problem, they had a heart problem. And all of these relate to how you and I correspond to our families. Maybe we allow our pride to keep us from amending things. Maybe we allow our trust issues. We have a problem trusting people. We allow that to separate us in our family. Or maybe we allow our heart in and of itself to harden itself rather than be pricked and change and try to be forgiving, try to be understanding. And it's hard. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not just going to make demands and then expect people to change. God doesn't do that. In fact, it would say in Romans 12:1-2, God calls us to a reasonable service. But sometimes we become unreasonable by throwing excuses along the way. And we looked at a couple of questions to try to work through this. So we're going to up this just a little bit today by looking at how we can reflect on problems in the right way. Now, the way chapter 2 begins, it begins by talking about the dissension between Esau and of Jacob. In fact, the very first sentence on page number 12, it would say the animosity between the Edomites and the people of Judah and Israel was rooted in the relationship of Jacob and Esau. Sometimes our animosity from the past is what's causing problems today. It's the way we handled those relationships back then, which right now is causing problems. In fact, when you look at all the things that the family went through, I apologize, this is small, but even from the womb, there was a struggling with the womb when Jacob and Esau were born. Esau was coming out of the womb, and it would say that there was a hand holding onto the heel of Jacob. Just a problem from childbirth. In fact, taking advantage of the birthright when Esau would be taken advantage of by Jacob. And not just that, but also there's regret found from that event. In fact, the parental favoritism. We talked about that a little bit. How Rebekah and Isaac started playing some favorites, and this caused some problems in the long run. And even if the brothers didn't have any problems, there could still be said that parental favoritism can cause problems within a family. Parents need to realize that. Uncles and aunts need to realize that because God doesn't play favorites, so parents shouldn't either. So we see not just with that, even adding to the struggle, the stolen blessing from Isaac to Jacob rather than to Isaac to Esau when he put that goat skin on his arm so that he would seem hairy. A desire to kill his brother. When Esau found out that Jacob stole the blessing, his initial response was, well, the days of my father's sorrow. He was saying, well, Dad's about to die. when he dies, I'll just take advantage of the opportunity and kill Jacob and we'll be over with it. Well, that would have just caused more problems. That wouldn't have solved anything. In fact, Esau was married to foreign wives. We go later into chapter 27 and we'll find that Jacob honored Isaac and Rebekah's statement to not marry pagan wives, foreign wives. And even when Esau found out what he did was bad, he didn't really go back on it. He just continued adding to the blister. And because of all this, they were separated for 20 years. Now, the thing we need to keep in mind when we go through all this in view of trying to live peaceably within our families, when you allow the past to cause problems in your present, God has a problem with you. If we don't try to figure out a way to work through these problems, what makes us think God will try to find a way to allow us into heaven? That's how this works. Now, he's not expecting closure per se. And what I mean by that is some people lay it off so long that the damage is, you can't do anything with it. Now, the thing that we do normally is we focus on that one problem in the past and we say, well, it's impossible to make amends today. Well, maybe we should allow the past to be the past and allow the present to be the present. Can't change the past. What I can change is who I am right now, who you are right now, and how we respond to that problem. So that's what we have to keep in mind. Now we'll come back to that idea here in a moment. When we go later down the line, we go from Jacob and Esau and their story and how they handled everything, and we go into our account today. Let's go ahead and read our text, verses 10 through 14. And today we're mainly focusing on Edom's history and what they did and what they did not do whenever Jerusalem was being ransacked by Babylon. The book of Obadiah, beginning in verse 10, the Bible would read, "For violence against your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. In the day that you stood on the other side, in the day that strangers carried captive his forces, when foreigners entered his gates, and cast lots for Jerusalem, even you were as one of them. But you should not have gazed on the day of your brother in the day of his captivity, nor should you have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor should you have spoken proudly in the day of distress. You should not have entered the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Indeed, you should not have gazed on their affliction in the day of their calamity, nor laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. You should not have stood at the crossroads to cut off those among them who escaped, nor should you have delivered up those among them who remained in the day of distress." When we look in the beginning aspect of this, and we're looking at section number 1 here on page 13, violence against Jacob. Although Edom were not the ones besieging or invading Judah, they were held responsible for wrongdoing of violence. I think actually in the text it would just say, you have done violence to your brother. Yes, violence against your brother. Another word for that is just wickedness. You've done something wrong. Well, what exactly did they do that was wrong? You go later on in the text, and it would say in the second half of verse 10 that shame would cover them. They were guilty of preventing Judah's escape in their captivity, or when they were about to go into captivity. Now, what's interesting with this, I don't remember if it's the book that says this. On page 17, at the top paragraph, it makes mention of their assistance. The Babylonians were able to capture King Zedekiah in 2 Kings 25, Jeremiah 39, and 52. Even though it says that the children of Israel were going towards the land of Jericho and the Jordan Valley, it doesn't say anything in that text about the Edomites preventing the Judeans from going there. It just says the Babylonians caught up to them. So I don't know if that's a loose reference or if they make a presumption about the text. I don't know. All I do know in Obadiah's text is that they did do something to prevent the children of Israel from fleeing from those who were fleeing. In fact, they took advantage of the situation by doing absolutely nothing. In fact, look at verse 11. "In the day that you stood on the other side, in the day that strangers carried captive his forces, when foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, even you were one of them." The idea of standing on the other side is seeing someone in distress and you doing absolutely nothing about it. You're not trying to aid them, but you are trying to aid the enemies by doing nothing. In fact, it's of interest in this same text. It makes mention on page 14, towards the middle of the page. Because they idly watched rather than actively involving themselves in defending their brethren, they were no better than the Babylonians. The sin of Edom, at least in part, was remaining neutral. Let this be a reminder to Christians today. And what they focus on in this section is, what if we had the opportunity to stand for truth and we do nothing? Well, in view of standing for the truth, God expects us to take a stance. He doesn't call us to be lukewarm. When I use that term, what church normally comes to mind if we use the phrase a lukewarm congregation? It also starts with an L. Laodicea. In fact, they were known for their hot springs in that region. They were very familiar with what was super hot and super cold. And God says, I'd rather spew you out of my mouth. You're not even drinkable. Well, that's a problem. God expects us to take a stance. It's of interest whenever you look at the references, 1 Peter 3:15, that we're to be ready always to give a defense for the reason of the hope that's in us. That's true. That means I have to know right from wrong. In fact, think of how many times Scripture would countlessly say over and over again, we're not to be carried away with false doctrines or careless doctrines as children tossed to and fro, but rather we're to rebuke those who stand in error, and we're to reprove, give evidence again to help supply our needs of faith to know what God says is right and wrong. Now, I do want to look at two texts before we go on with this. I do want us to look at Ephesians 4:14 and 15. Ephesians 4:14 and 15. And if someone would like to read that for us.
Whereby they lie in wait to deceive. But speaking the truth in love, they grow up into Him in all things, which is the head, even Christ.
Now, what's interesting with this in verse 13 of this text, he is talking about the church. He's not necessarily talking about our response to people in the world, even though this same principle does apply. However, let's think of it this way. If you know someone who grew up in the church and they've heard these lessons, you've heard them say the right things, you've seen them live the right way, and then later in life they decide to leave the faith, are you going to approach them the same way you're going to approach someone who has no idea from Adam to Jesus that the book of Roman noodles is in the Bible? Are you going to approach them the same way as you are someone who knows better? Absolutely not. My method's going to be a little different. However, even though I'm going to be rebuking someone, also in view of someone who knows absolutely nothing, I still have to carry out verse 15 as well. Speaking the truth in love. Love can show itself in a variety of ways. Hebrews chapter 12 is very good because it talks about if the Lord loves you, He chastens you as a father would his son. Sometimes we tend to think that true love doesn't disagree or true love doesn't cause dissension. However, truth is truth. If you're doing something that's contrary to the truth and I call you out for it, is that wrong? Or is that love? That is love. We call that hard love. Because, yeah, you're trying to fight against the pricks, as Jesus would tell Paul. And in fact, the proverb writer would say, as iron sharpens iron, so a friend sharpens the countenance of his friend. I need that disciplinary love. But I also need that love who understands if I don't know better, I need to have that same kind of love in trying to reach out to those kind of people that, what you're doing is not right. Let me show you why. Or maybe in a roundabout way, if we think of how Nathan the prophet came to David. Nathan could have died In fact, if David didn't take the Bathsheba incident correctly, Nathan could have been killed. However, he used his story. That's a little off. Well, it was because Nathan was trying to show a guy who knew better. He was trying to show him an illustration that he would understand in one playing field, and then he related it with his relationship with God. Aha, got it. Maybe sometimes I need to use that roundabout way to help direct them to a point, rather than sometimes being blunt. What it takes for me, in order to reach that individual in that way, I've got to know them. I've got to learn them. However, if I never took time to get to learn them in the first place, we got a problem there from the very beginning. Any thoughts or any comments on that before we go on?
You don't have to be buddy-buddy. Observe different evidence like personality, beliefs, carry themselves.
See, now Jesus uses that same ideology. If you watch the Pharisees and the religious leaders, you can tell by what they preach. If you watch them after they're done preaching, they're not living up to what they're preaching. Don't be like them in that regard. Do follow what they're preaching. That's right. But even, I think it's Isaiah chapter 2. Let me make sure that's the right text. It might be 11. It's chapter 11. Chapter 11, verse 2 through 5. It talks about the different spirits, really the different kind of characters that would reside within the branch of Jesse. And in view of this, he wouldn't judge according to what he sees. He wouldn't judge according to just by what he hears, but rather he would judge righteously. He's not going to take other people's preconceptions as to how they should render this judgment, but rather he's going to allow the circumstances, the personality, really allowing the evidence to answer for itself. He was going to allow the full case to present itself before he makes a choice. In fact, it's of interest, why would the Father allow Jesus to be the one to judge all mankind at the end of time? I know God has appointed him king. I know God has appointed him high priest. But why of all people would Jesus be the judge of eternity? Absolutely. And that's it, because the Father deemed, you've got more experience on this. You are the right person for this job. That's not a flaw in God. That's just God recognizing you're the one who's for this position. Now, that might cause a conundrum in the Godhead, but here's the purpose. If the Father deemed fit to appoint the Son to that position, who am I to turn around and say, well, the Father just isn't good enough for it? If the Father deems it worthy enough in his infinite wisdom, I'm going to trust him in allowing Jesus, the righteous judge, wonderful counselor, the Prince of Peace, I'm going to allow him to be in that position because the Father deems him worthy of that position. So I trust his judgment. In fact, we're through the book of Habakkuk. It's that same concept. You're of everlasting, O Lord. If you deem them for correction, who am I to turn around and say you're not right in doing so? I trust God in that judgment. So Jesus is the one worthy of that. He made those observations when he was here on earth. And you're right. If we just watch people watch, you can learn a lot about people just from how they respond, how they act. And even when they're not talking, body language is key, big time key. So that's a good point, really good point. Now secondary, since Edom fell victim to all of these things, they didn't do anything, they were idle, they prevented Judah from escaping, as it would say in the text. What about their disinterest towards Judah? Well, as we look through this, there's three things in verse 12, and it's just verse 12 and 13 in this section. It would say, but you should not have gazed on your brother, gazed on the day of your brother in the day of his captivity, nor should you have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction. Nor should you have spoken proudly in the day of distress, You should have not entered the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Indeed, you should not have gazed on their affliction in the day of their calamity, nor laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. If you notice in this text, oftentimes it talks about the day of their calamity. There's a lot of things that Edom did not do and did do whenever Babylon came in and ransacked the whole place. In this case, verse 12, we connected with the first phrase of verse 11. You stood on the other side and you just watched and did absolutely nothing. So there are three issues that God has with them. They just looked at them, did absolutely nothing. And not just that, rejoiced, it would say in the middle of verse 12, neither should thou have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction. You know, it may have made sense in the early part of Jacob and Esau's tension if Esau would have known around the same time that all those problems started happening. He may have laughed at Jacob if he would have known all the things that would have happened to him with Laman and his two daughters. Esau probably chuckle and laugh. But I don't see that whenever they make the return to reconcile towards one another. In fact, that's not even any of the conversation. We find an act of repentance, a heart of repentance of Jacob's attitude towards Esau. And then Esau's questioning this, like, why are you giving me all this? God has blessed me richly. You keep what you have because it's yours. And if that wasn't enough, Jacob would say, let my master, let my Lord go ahead of me because I have many flocks. We're wearisome. We're going to be a little bit behind as we travel with you. And Esau left some of his servants to help and tend to Jacob's flocks and wives and children. I think that shows in a roundabout way Esau had no hard feelings about that. There were some moments of remorse, more than likely. But we find a guy who says, look, what's in the past is in the past. We can't change that. All we can change right now is how we handle that in the present. Now, with Edom's case, in view of their brethren, their relatives of Jacob, as it would say in verse 10, of your brother Jacob. And even the beginning of verse 12, gazed on the day of your brother. Not only were they selfish and they rejoiced whenever bad things happened to him, but they were boastful about this as if, you rightfully deserve this. You had this coming. Well, as true as that was, is it ever justified for me to laugh at someone else's calamities? Absolutely not. In fact, you think of it in the most disgusting way. Many people still today laugh at Christ the same way those around Christ were laughing at him. He claims to be the Son of God. Why don't you just take yourself down from that cross? He can save others, but he himself he cannot save. Well, he could. In fact, he would say in John, 15? I lay down my life. No, 10. John 10. The shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. And if I have the power to lay it down, I have the power to take it back up. If I so choose to give my life as a sacrifice for everyone in the world, that's my call. But you can't say that I don't have the power to take it back. If I wanted to, I could. But I didn't come here to do my will, but the will of the Father who sent me. Not only is that selflessness, it's also discipline, because you have someone who's doing something that is most definitely not pleasant. In fact, I think it would say a couple of times in Philippians 2 and maybe, or Philippians 2 and Hebrews 12, despising the shame of the cross. He was looking forward to the joy of the eternal crown waiting for him, which God has elevated and exalted him and placed him on high to have a name like no other name, power like no other power. There was a beauty in submission. And in fact, even in view of the Hebrews text, though he were a son, yet he learned obedience through the things that he suffered. You have the most obedient man to ever live. And the text is telling me he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. I thought he was already perfect. It was part of the process to show us how we can become perfected, even through suffering. Christ was looking forward to the eternal weight of glory that was waiting for him in an act of obedience, even if it meant the termination of his life. It was for a greater cause. In fact, a text we won't read into, but in John chapter 11, about verse 52 and following, Caiaphas would make a pronouncement because he was the high priest that year. And he would say, is it expedient that one man should die for all the nation? Not knowing that he was prophesying that Christ would bring all people in one through his sacrifice. Yes, it is expedient because he's the only one who could do it. In view of God's eternal plan, that was the perfect person for it. It will always be the perfect person for it, not you and I. Now, it's interesting what happened between Edom and Judah. When we go back to them, in view of their calamity, which the answer to number 4 is prideful boastings. Well, really, it's all 3 of these. What 3 things was Edom victim of? It makes a point here on page number 15 in view of greed. In fact, it would say that greed is always contrary to God's plan, but it's especially grievous to take advantage of those who have been defeated. In fact, it's of interest in view of our responsibility as Christians. When we refuse to help people in their greatest needs, refusal to help in others' greatest needs, I'm missing a word, gives God reason to return my doings to me. You think about it. What's the greatest need you and I have? Salvation. And getting to heaven, how would we do that? Through salvation. We need forgiveness of sins. If we dare think that in our lives, with anybody, this is anybody, and this is more so with our families, because oftentimes we allow circumstances to harden us to say, well, it's impossible, I've tried, and then we stop. Well, with God, what if I choose to do that with a select number of people? Do you think God owes it to me because I've limited my affection towards others? Do you think God owes me to allow me into heaven because I'm a child of God? Absolutely not. If I can't help others in their greatest distresses, and I say you're just unworthy of that, woe be to you come Judgment Day. That's not how it works. In fact, Matthew 25, verse 40, inasmuch as you did it unto the least of these, you did it unto me. Regardless of who the person is, there's still a need, as God would say, look, it might be wrong. You might say they don't deserve this, and in reality, they don't. But you're teaching them a greater lesson. I desire mercy over sacrifice. I like to poke fun at it, but I think it was a Wednesday night. David wasn't here. David Hicks wasn't here. It's because his neighbor's field was on fire, and I just kind of joked around with him. I'm like, David, that's not a reason to miss church. Yeah, it is. You had a neighbor who had a need. I mean, what had he not stopped? What would have happened? Well, it probably would have been a lot worse. They ultimately got the fire out. But I mean, you see someone who has an ox in the ditch, even under the Old Testament law, you find an animal who's run away from his owner, you know what the right response was? No, that's your problem, dude. I got to go worship God. Go return the animal. Sometimes there are ox in the ditch, and we've got to tend to those. Especially if it's someone else's ox, we need to tend to those as well. It's of interest that in view of how the Jews responded to Jesus when he would try to heal someone and it was the Sabbath day, sometimes we tend to have that same response in view of church attendance. And what I mean by that is if something comes up that's not normal, but it's an opportunity for you to help. You know what God expects of you and I? We stop and we have a good Samaritan moment with this. I'm going to take you to an inn, make sure you're taken care of. The whole point of that is I'm going to address your needs the best I can before I go off and continue on my journey. That's the purpose. Time is irrelevant in view of being kind rather than greedy. In fact, another verse I think that's on here, Galatians chapter 6, as we therefore have opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially those the household of faith. I know some people who read that verse as we therefore have opportunity, let us do good unto those who are of the household of faith. Now, that's not what the text says, because there's an extra clause before that, especially those of the household of faith. But some people use that to legitimize saying, I don't have to help people in the world. Now, it's very easy to see how that works, and this is something we've got to keep subconsciously in our mind. If you're at the store, or if we're here at services, well, let's start with here at services. The store is a different scenario. If we have a visitor here, and then we have members who are constantly here just about every week, who should we be spending more time with? Visitors. It's of interest. Jesus would say the same thing in the Sermon on the Mount. You don't do anything better than the scribes and the Pharisees who give warm welcomes to each other, pat each other on the back. You're doing so good. And then you have the stranger here who's being neglected. Well, in God's family, there is no such thing as strangers. Might be someone you're not so much acquainted with. The responsibility at that point is, look, we'll get to say, hey, at some point later on today, hopefully, maybe we don't. Then we'll just be like, well, I'll talk to you next time. But if it's someone who's brand new to God's family, guess what you're going to be getting? A nice warm welcome from everyone, because you're our honored guest. Interesting. So, yes, you have a comment?
The churches I attended, I won't mention the name, but we had a stranger man, a visitor, and he was dead. And all that he asked was that they post the song numbers on the board so he could follow the worship. He didn't sing, but he wanted to read the song and sing it in his heart. They didn't oblige him for that. And I was very distressed about that. That's wonderful.
Well, see, those are kind of things that tend to happen every week, unfortunately. But it's us really paying attention to those small things. And we think of them as small things, but really they're not small things. They're really big things for people who aren't accustomed to it. So really it's making that good impression from the get-go of, look, this is how it is. And then once we become a little acquainted, maybe I'll have a little bit more time to talk with everyone else. But that's how it's supposed to be. It's also in view of the 99 who are safe in the fold. I see you every time. But if I don't get to see you as often, I might talk to you a little bit more because I'm a little concerned. But if you're a visitor and you're new to the fold, or you're checking in the flock and seeing what this is all about, you're going to be my prime target for the entire day, at least till we part ways. So unfortunately, that does happen. Should not be the case. But as Peter and John would say in Acts chapter 3, verse 6, silver and gold have I none, but that which I have, I give you. So in the name of Jesus Christ, please rise. Sometimes if all we can do is take people to Christ, that's of more value than silver and gold. Last thing to keep in mind, I got to skyrocket through this, not greed, but rather grieve whenever calamity happens to other people. 1 John chapter 3, verse 17. You see someone who has needs and you shut up your bowels of mercy or being able to help them. The love of God is not in you. In fact, James 2 is we have opportunity. If you see someone who has needs, go tend to their needs. Don't just pass by through those things. Now, Edom also as well, they had a bad family tradition. In fact, Numbers 20, you would see they would give refusal to allow Israel safe passage. They had to go around, and that's where we've got the whole Jericho incident later on after this take place. There were some battles that took place. But also with this, we find that Edom gave up on those who needed mercy through imprisonment. It was one thing to do nothing towards them, but also when there were some who were coming their way looking for a place of safety, they took advantage of their misfortunes and made it even worse. God doesn't call us to take misfortunes and make them worse. He calls us to take misfortunes and lead them to the great physician, to find mercy in time of need. What if it's God's way for you and I to help others? What if it's God's request of us to tend to those who are looking for truth, to tend to those who are looking for comfort, who are looking for a place of safety? Edom didn't do that. In fact, they gave in to selfish desires when God simply required them to be selfless. Colossians 3, 6 through 10, don't have time to read through it, but if you look through it, it deals with attitudes and our response to other people. Some of those attitudes are really hard not to have. being angry towards people, having bitterness towards people, or even just having anxiety towards people and just not wanting to do anything with them. But that's not what Christ has called us to be. He's called us to become new creatures, which means there's a renewal of the mind. Might be a daily process we have to work through as we go through this. Last section with this, in view of how this relates to relatives, the Edomites were selfish, they were greedy, they were idle when their brethren were in need. Just 2 points to take away from this. Some animosities may be rooted in relationship. However, I need to dictate that the past cannot dictate the present without consequence. Peter would ask Jesus, if my brother offends me, how many times must I forgive him? Well, if he repents as many times as he offends you, guess what? You forgive him. However, what do we do towards those who never actually say, I'm sorry to us? Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Now, I'm still going to be waiting for a conversation maybe later on. But there's no point in me wasting my time thinking and dwelling on the past when I understand you just don't get it. I've got better things to keep my mind on. I've got to keep that attitude up. Yes? So in Matthew 7, 1 through about 6 or 7 in that text, it's talking about using sound judgment. Sometimes when you use sound judgment towards people and you're trying to do the right thing, they're trying to do everything in their power not to do the right thing, and they don't get it. So when you're trying to lay down the law and just be very straightforward and you're trying to be kind about it, sometimes it's like, look, it's better if you just suffer through this and just go along with this, because you're casting all this good judgment out and it's not going to do any good. They don't recognize sound judgment from unsound judgment. That text isn't talking about sharing the gospel with someone. It's just talking about making judgment calls. And even when you look in view of just the law of America, some people just don't get it. They don't see a problem with, if the police aren't doing their job, then I have the right to violate the law as well. That's not wise judgment. So in that case, sometimes you might be arguing with a brick wall. God just says, look, just get over that. Don't cast that judgment towards them. Yes?
Wasn't it 20 years that Jacob and Esau stayed separated?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess during that time, the people grew angry and resentful with Jacob.
It could have been the case, yeah.
Well, something got to that point, so they must have harbored it through generations.
Well, what we'll find out next week when we look at their story, they made amends and fixed those problems. What happened was there was a separation in communication to continue checking in on one another, which led to problems. So it wasn't so much that Jacob and Esau they did make a mess, and they made amends even though it took 20 years. It's just no one tried to continue on that conversation. So it's almost like they looked at some of the story, but they didn't keep in mind the ending of that story. So it's almost like if we don't remember history, history is bound to repeat itself. That's what we find. And then the last thing, allegiance is also rooted in relationship. This one is how we keep constant communication with one another. The disciples were with one another in the temple daily. In fact, we're to encourage one another daily, provoking one another with love. If we're not finding a way to encourage one another, even if I might not be able to see you face to face, do you pray for me on a daily basis? I know praying every day might be something hard, especially towards other people. Not saying I don't bless my food or give like little general prayers, but do you keep me in mind every day? I'm glad I have a high priest who does that, but am I able to share that love enough to where I hope you have a blessed day, even if I can't see you that day? So in view of that, animosity, relationships, when I allow the past to cause problems in the present, God does have a problem with me. Now, what we're going to see next week is we're going to see how Jacob and Esau rendered this problem and solved it after a 20-year gap, and how we might be able to resolve problems a little quicker today in view of God's judgment on Edom. So even though we're talking about the day of the Lord next week, we are going to be talking about the day of the Lord from two perspectives, in view of the wicked, but also in view of the righteous who just don't believe God. So any thoughts or any questions? Okay, thank you for your time and attention. We'll be back in 10 minutes, Lord willing.